Good afternoon, bonjour, assalamu alaikum, and yali madad. My name is Mars Narani, and I am the Digital Communication Specialist at the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We welcome you to our speaking session for Allyship against Islamophobia. We are so excited to welcome Rumina Morris to Western. Before we begin with Rumina's introduction, I would like to make you aware of some resources available to attendees. The closed captions have been enabled. You can access the captions by hitting the CC button in your control bar. The chat function has been disabled for this event. If you have a question, please submit it to the Q&A tab in your control options, and we will review them at the end. Secondly, we would like to remind students, staff, and faculty at Western to complete the Western Equity Census. Beginning in October of 2021, the Western Equity Census is the first ever comprehensive demographic survey for all staff, students, and faculty, which will help us to understand the demographics of the university and enhance the support of diversity and inclusion of our community. The census, which is voluntary and confidential, takes less than 5 minutes to complete. It is available through My Human Resources for Employees and Student Center for Students. To learn more, please visit president.uwo.ca/equity census. We will begin with a land acknowledgement offered by Rahat Ahmed, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Education Coordinator with Wellness and Wellbeing.
Thank you so much, Mars, and thank you, Leslie and Rumina and Anna in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for organizing this event and inviting me to give the land acknowledgement. I appreciate you all being here. We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Pewag, and Choctaw nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombar Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rahat, for a beautiful land acknowledgement. Lastly, before we begin with introducing our speaker, we would like to remember our London family. June 6, 2022 marked the 1-year anniversary of the terrorist attack that took the lives of 4 of the 5 members of the Afzal family. Please join us for a one-minute moment of silence to honor our London family and recognize those suffering from hate-related trauma in our community. Thank you, everyone. Now we welcome Leslie Oliver, the EDI specialist from the Office of EDI, to introduce our special guest speaker.
Thanks, Mars. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce our guest speaker to you today. I met Rumina several years ago when she stepped up to lead the city's volunteer task force to address anti-racism, which was an action item that arose from the city's EDI strategic planning focus groups. Rumina is an anti-racism, anti-oppression, equity, and inclusion expert, providing consulting and coaching services to leaders and organizations who are committed to effecting change. She has spent over 17 years in leadership positions where she has managed diverse teams in the human services sector and currently serves as the City of London's Director of Anti-Racism and Anti-Oppression. Rumina has also been a strong advocate for social justice and human rights and has used her own privilege as a leader to draw attention to systemic inequities and demand change. Rumina thrives on lifelong learning and unlearning. By creating space for others to do the same, she's able to facilitate critical self-reflection drawing attention to unconscious and unacknowledged biases. Her expertise has bridged the gap between the vision of being an inclusive organization and actioning those goals in an intentional and strategic manner. She explores organizational culture with an equity lens to shed light on opportunities for growth. Please join the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in welcoming Rumina to share with us her presentation, Allyship Against Islamophobia. Actions are louder than words. Welcome, Rumina.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and to all of you who have invited me to be here today. I truly appreciate the opportunity to reflect and to talk a little bit about allyship, particularly in regards to Islamophobia. And so I'm going to share my screen with you, and let's begin. And so, as you've already identified, Leslie, I don't need to say any more than what you've said, that is absolutely a lovely way to introduce me. That is, there's a lot in what you said that is true in terms of my, particularly in my role as the Director of Anti-Racism and Anti-Oppression with the City of London, and in particular in terms of trying to combat Islamophobia within our community on a very local level. So I won't spend any more time there, but I do want to start off, as I always like to in any presentation, as we talk about things that tend to give us some level of discomfort. I like to offer a cup of discomfort on the table virtually for all of us, myself included, to sip from. And I say that because this work and these types of conversations do elicit a level of discomfort. They should. And I strongly feel that is because we haven't spoken about many of these issues out loud, and particularly not at an organizational level. So some of us in racialized bodies have definitely had conversations about how we are impacted by racial harm. But in an organization and in a workplace, these conversations haven't been happening. And so they do elicit a level of discomfort. And I just like to acknowledge that right up front. That's a very small cup that you see there. I chug from the cup every time, no matter how many times I talk about these topics. It still arises in me a level of discomfort, and just even talking about some very painful things that are either personal or even other people's experiences that I've heard and have experienced through them. So I just like to put that on the table and expect that there may be some level of discomfort, and let that not immobilize us. Let us move through that, because when we get stuck in our discomfort, that is when change is not able to happen. We have to move through that. And so I encourage you to stay with me to the end of this presentation. And even if there are emotions of discomfort, let's keep going and see where we get to on the other end of this conversation. And so, as has already been done, and I really appreciate that moment of silence, this has been an incredible year, and we really do need to reflect on how this happened, why this happened, and more importantly, how we can ensure it never happens again. And so, I started in my role with the city on June 1st of 2021, and it was a daunting career choice for me, I will say. Just to be able to affect change on an organizational level and on a community level was not an easy decision for me to make. And 5 days into my role, I was told by the city manager that the Afzal family was not just struck down as an accident, but that it was in fact an act of hate, of terror. And it put our city on the nation-wide lens. And so it became extraordinarily clear to me that the work and the need for this type of initiatives in terms of trying to disrupt Islamophobia was never more needed than in this moment. And so it's been a year, and in that year, my entire career has been sandwiched between dealing with the grief and the aftermath that the community has experienced and leading up to the events that happened on Monday to commemorate the family. We engaged a lot with the diverse Muslim communities. As you can imagine, that was something that our council had specifically asked. On June 15th, they endorsed a motion for us to go forth and to engage with the Muslim communities and listen and learn in terms of, firstly, how can we honor this family? How do we honor them in an appropriate way? And then also, how do we highlight the contributions of Muslim community members in our city? And lastly, we were tasked with really coming up with a plan on how do we address Islamophobia within our community. And we're a unique community. London has a very high population of Muslim families who've been here for many, many years. And so really wanted to get into how as a community can we come together and put our pain to purpose, if you will. And so earlier this year, we delivered an action plan based on many recommendations from the communities. We gathered the Muslim community, as I said, communities, as well as community organization leaders. So including yourselves at Western, we had healthcare, hospital, police, the library, museum, like everybody that we could think of, particularly those who are a part of systems, and brought everybody together to determine what is the right way for us to really make some headway. We knew that the entire nation was watching to see what will London do with what's happened. And so really wanted to deliver a model for folks to really engage on this topic and to ensure that we are really working tangibly towards disrupting Islamophobia. And what became very clear right from the outset was that there are things that we can do on a very community level, and we will do, and we will deliver on those recommendations. But what also was very clear is that there are a number of things that need to have advocacy to other levels of government. Certainly our provincial government and our federal government have made a lot of statements in terms of what they are planning to do. And you know, the title for this in terms of actions are louder than words is really rooted in a lot of words were spoken. And what you might have noticed if you were witnessing any of the events on Monday, very different from the vigil and the events that happened immediately after the terror attack. We heard from many politicians, a lot of words were said. And the demand at that time from the community was, words aren't going to cut it. We have lost an entire family here. Words will not be enough. We need to see action. That demand came loud and clear following the terror attack. What we heard also and what we saw on Monday was this: the events that commemorated the 1-year anniversary were very much rooted in healing. There were very few politicians, aside from our Prime Minister who did come, who spoke at the vigil, as well as at the march. There was an intentionality. Those two events were led by youth. That emerged from the community engagement that we heard, that the youth were not heard after the terror attack, and they were impacted. They lost their friends. And so the youth were very clear that they wanted this 1-year anniversary to be about healing, to be about reclaiming, and to not have empty words. And so I feel very proud that as a municipal and on a community level, we can actually say that we are doing things tangibly to address Islamophobia. I'm not sure about the other levels of government at this point. But that came loud and clear. And so what we heard through the community engagement and what we heard through even our events on Monday were that, yes, words matter. And that came certainly from our Prime Minister and from our Mayor, but also that words are not enough, that we literally have to start actioning things so that we are not in this place again. So as I said, the youth voice was lost after the initial days after the attack, and we really wanted to make sure that they were centered in any events that move forward. The other thing that was very clear was that there is a need for us to work as a community, and that the Muslim communities were very honest with us in saying that Islamophobia needs to be addressed. Absolutely. However, they were also very clear about allyship with other equity deserving groups. So I can't tell you how many Muslim community members said to me, yes, we must address Islamophobia, and particularly because it is so gendered. There is such a gendered impact for hijabi Muslim women, particularly. Yes, we must do that. However, this is not just about Islamophobia. The hate that drives people to have such racist views on Muslims is not exclusive to Muslims, right? So if you don't like Muslims, there's a very good chance that you don't like Jewish people. There's a very good chance that you have no love for Black people or Indigenous people. In fact, the other is what you hate. And so they were very clear that we cannot work in isolation and address Islamophobia without addressing other things. What we also recognized was that in addressing Islamophobia, we can actually get to the root of what is causing that hate. And so much of the recommendations that came out, yes, came from the Muslim community, but will actually better things for other equity deserving groups. Much of what they talked about was around advocacy, awareness. What came very loud and clear, and if you get a chance to look at the report that we delivered to council earlier this year, the education sector was targeted in terms of their additional responsibility. and we're talking obviously from elementary all the way to post-secondary, that the education system has an additional responsibility to ensure that they are not upholding sentiments of Islamophobia or any other types of hate. So we know that all of our systems have been founded on colonial systems, but the education system has a different responsibility. And a lot of reflection after the attack, of course, was that this was a homegrown terrorist, that this person had come out of our education system, and how had this gone without notice. And so there is a strong emphasis on educators to really look and identify how they may be upholding things, whether it's through curriculum, whether it's individual people and their own biases, whether it is barriers to faculty and the representation of the demographic representation of people who work within these institutions. That is not exclusive to educators, but there is an extra responsibility that was very clearly identified through the working group. And so I leave that with you to sort of ponder as we start to talk a little bit more about some of the things in terms of allyship and what can be done differently moving forward. So we'll get to allyship, but if we don't understand the impact of racism and understand it as trauma, then what's the point of trying to be an ally if you don't really appreciate why this is so important? And so I want to just spend a minute explaining a little bit about how racism is experienced as trauma, and nobody can convince me differently. I'm a social worker by background. I have a private practice where I do race-based trauma therapy, and I literally serve folks who are in equity deserving groups. And I listen to the pain of what it is, and my own lived experience, obviously, of what it is to be in an othered body and how that impacts on our mental health and our well-being. So what's interesting to note, if you know anything about trauma, this can result from one major experience. So if you take out racism and talk about trauma in general, if you witness a horrific accident, if you have something very violent crime happen, or you've even watching through not having it happen directly to you, one incident can be so traumatic. If you've ever had a horrible, a car crash, for example, the post-traumatic stress disorder piece around that and how people navigate one horrible experience can be life-changing, life-altering, and life-impactful from one experience. But we also know with trauma that when you have ongoing incidents of trauma, smaller, but ongoing, for example, children that grow up in homes where there's a lot of domestic violence, ongoing for years, those small occurrences build up to a very similar experience of experiencing trauma, okay? Racial harm is no different. In that, you could have one horrific incident. So I think of someone that I know within this community who, a friend of mine who had come out of her driveway in the winter to drive her kids to daycare. And on the back of her windshield, somebody had with their finger through the snow, had put the N-word on the back of her car. So obviously someone in the neighborhood enough. You can imagine how fearful and how dysregulating that would be. One incident of harm like that can be absolutely triggering and traumatizing and instilling fear in somebody. Similarly, microaggressions, we talk about them all the time, and we often think of them as small, little, subtle things, and they are subtle acts of exclusion, if you will. However, the micro is really because it's on a one-to-one level as opposed to macro. So microaggressions are not happening on the systemic level, they are happening on an individual level. And ongoingly being othered. Where are you from? I can't say your name. If you're okay, I'd like to call you this. You're very pretty for a dark person. These kind of things that people experience over and over again, which is othering, can have a very similar effect. I can't tell you how many clients I have who experience very similar the same mental health issues that you would imagine for other types of trauma in the workplace through microaggressions, having to navigate on a daily basis spaces where they are othered. So the impact of the trauma is no different than any other type of trauma. And so we have to see it as that so that we can understand, again, why it is so important for us to address these things in our allyship role. Just to take it a little bit further, what happens when racial harm is experienced? When I sort of wrap my head around this, it validated so much for me and what I see in other people's experiences. So the incident itself, as you can imagine from my friend when she came out and saw the N-word on the back of her truck or her SUV, that incident in and of itself, of course, is experienced as an offense against your dignity. And it doesn't have to be something that traumatic. It could be a slight microaggression that has you feeling the offense as an indignation. That is absolutely real. But what it also does, and what this validates for me, is that it triggers all of the times that this has happened before. So when I'm asked, where am I from? And I have to give you a 10-hour story of I'm a daughter of colonization, and I often describe myself as such. When I am asked that, or when I experience these types of indignation, it triggers all the times that it's happened to me throughout my lifetime. It builds on, it's not in an isolation. So when I feel it in that moment, but I also am drawing on all of the memories and the experiences of how many times this has happened. It could have happened 10 minutes ago, never mind when I was a child. So it's a culmination of that harm is how we experience it. Further though, it also is experienced as we know about intergenerational trauma. And what happens is, so when we think about things that have happened in our community, even when we think about what just happened recently in Buffalo, those types of incidents have us going back to a lifetime and generations of harm that has happened and the injustices of other people across nations. There is that sort of overwhelming response that comes in the body that is triggered by one incident, building on your own personal lifetime of incidents, building on generations of incidents and the injustices that people have experienced. So when people say things like, when there's a microaggression happen, for example, you're being so sensitive, don't overreact. I want to give you some context in terms of there is no overreaction in this. If it feels deep, it's because it is deep. If it feels as if it is a huge thing, it's because it is a huge thing. And so when we can appreciate that the experience of people in racialized bodies is felt as such, then we can understand why it is so incumbent upon us to do things differently, that we can't just see things in isolation and incidents as separate from the bigger picture. And that goes across. So again, when you think about, I don't know if you've heard, but something happened in Germany today. A car that has gone onto the sidewalk and has killed at least one person and has injured many. How does that not trigger folks over here? We are just commemorating the 1-year anniversary of something. We don't know whether it was an accident. They haven't said whether or not it was racially motivated. We don't know. Even if it was an accident, the incident itself will trigger a very similar response to our community members. What I can tell you is that the Muslim community continues to be afraid, that they continue to be fearful of going for walks today, a year later. How long that will last, we don't know, but we have to recognize that things happening around us are impacting our own experiences here, okay? So the effects of racial trauma, as I said, are very, very real. Of course, the more exposure you have to racism, your symptoms tend to intensify, and that will be, obviously dependent on so many individual factors in terms of your neighborhood, your workplace, those types of things. But we know that the more racism one experiences, the more the symptoms tend to intensify. And of course, you can anticipate what you would expect with any type of trauma, and that is that there is decreased mental and physical health. What I, again, as an adult, never appreciating as a younger person, the toll that it takes to navigate and the stress that is required to navigate our world in an othered body is very, very real. I think for me, I'm only really starting to appreciate how different that is and what a privilege to not have to deal with, to not have to think about, to not have to worry about walking on the streets. To not have to worry about going to a grocery store and being called something, saying something, even the go back to where you came from kind of comment. Those of us in racialized bodies, and particularly those who are visibly racialized, or as I said, particularly women who wear the hijab, for example, that is daily life and has been for their entire existence. And to be able to consider that there is another way to be is almost absolutely unimaginable. So the toll and the stress of just existing in a space that does not reflect you, often does not welcome you, has a toll. on our mental and physical health. And what you can expect and what we see are the very things that are listed here in terms of avoidance, hypervigilance, nightmares, anxiety, and hypervigilance meaning like constantly questioning, is it me? Is it something I said? Should I have done something differently? How could I have avoided this? Guilt, shame, embarrassment of who we are. It's just such a horrible thing to think when there is no shame in being who you are, right? Anger, and obviously in some of the worst situations, suicidal ideations, and of course depression, and literally post-traumatic stress disorder. This is very real, okay? So with all of that being understood in terms of what is happening to people in othered bodies on a regular, daily, almost moment by moment basis, we now have to consider, so what can we do? What can we do? Those of us, so I am not a hijabi Muslim. I have a privilege in that. I have an advantage over my sisters who do wear the hijab. What can I do? When I say we, I mean me as well. We all have some level of privilege in some way, in some regard. So how do we leverage that privilege to ensure that we are doing our part? What does it truly mean to be an ally? So what can you do? A lot of conversation about being aware of your biases. There is no such thing as bias free. So if you hear that and people in equity work do use that language and I don't understand it, there is nothing, our human minds are absolutely dependent on bias. Bias is not the problem. It's designed to protect us. It's designed to keep us safe. It is to recognize when there is a threat. We cannot remove bias from our minds. What we need to understand is that bias, the way that our minds are biased comes from the environment that we're in, right? And what does that mean? Of course, it means, what are we soaking up? What are we being taught in our schools? What are we watching in our news and in our media? What are we seeing reflected in our movies and our magazines, in all of those types of things? So our bias can be incorrect, may need to be disrupted, may need to be reflected on and critically reflected on, to help us understand that the world, that the way we see things is not necessarily how others see it. So we all have bias. We're not getting rid of it. What we want to do is bring it to a conscious level. That's something we can all do, right? And one of the ways to do that is to believe people. So when people say, I have experienced this feels harmful, and I should qualify, specifically around things like microaggressions. Oftentimes the response will be things like, well, my Black neighbor heard that joke and didn't think it was offensive, so I'm not sure why you're taking offense to it. And I can see why people get caught up in that. Why are people having different responses to the very same behavior that I exhibit? And this is where I say believe. If somebody says this harmed me, you don't get to say, well, excuse me, but, because you can appreciate that everybody is going to have a different lived experience. Everyone is going to have a different energy level. There are many factors that impact how people respond. So if I think about environments that are male dominated, right? Look, I think about police and fire and those types of, and construction, those types of work areas. If a misogynistic joke is made and a woman laughs along in that situation, that could be because of her belief that she needs to be safe, that she needs to keep things, copacetic so that she's not causing any, drawing attention to herself. There are many reasons why somebody may not say something. And safety is one of them. So you don't get to decide for somebody whether or not they really did experience this as harm. We have to trust that if somebody says something, we must believe them. That is something we can do and not center ourselves in that. We absolutely have to unlearn. Again, if we think about the things that we have learned, and we're doing so much better and yet have so much more to do. We're talking about things in the education system that we didn't before. However, many of us, at least in my generation, are really having to unlearn and really understand that we have been influenced by our educators and by our environment, and disrupt that and unlearn. These are things that we can do. And also advocacy, right? Advocating for change, advocating on behalf of people. These are tangible things that we can do. There's more. Let's understand allyship. And I love Michelle Kim's definition, where she says allyship is an active and consistent practice of using your power, so power and privilege, to achieve equity and inclusion while holding ourselves accountable to marginalized people's needs. And I think there's a key piece to that, is that when we are doing allyship, so there's a few things. One, it is active, it's a verb, right? You don't get to say, I'm an ally, just because that's not how it works. Allyship is a doing, right? You also don't get to call yourself an ally. Those who are, as she says here, who we are accountable to, so who we are in solidarity with, those are the folks that get to tell you, you're an ally. I appreciate what you are doing. You don't get to do that for yourself. That's not how it works. Because how do you measure whether or not you are an ally, if not through the eyes of those who you are standing in solidarity with? Okay. What Michelle Kim goes on to talk about, and if you Google her and look up allyship and accomplice, she goes further to talk about this idea of accomplishship. We'll talk more about allyship, but accomplice, where she's going with that, and it's actually rooted in indigeneity, is where you are not just when it's convenient and safe for you to do so, saying something and doing something to be an ally towards others. Accompliship is actually where you are taking it as if you are taking a risk. There is no safety in accompliship. So that you recognize that you may, as I have done, lost a job for speaking out about microaggressions. That's being an accomplice. Again, I shouldn't identify myself as one, but it's an example of the microaggressions that I experienced in a workplace were not directed at me. They were directed at somebody else, a different equity deserving group. And when I spoke up about it and was repeatedly told, please stop that, was eventually let go. I knew that that was a risk that I was taking. That's accomplice, where I'm not doing it when it's only safe and convenient, but only when there's no risk to me. I'm doing it where I know I could actually take a hit. I could actually lose my income. I could actually lose my job. That's taking it a step further. Not everybody can do that. I don't by any means suggest that everybody must be an accomplice, but I do feel like that's the direction that we need to go in. And I'll get to that at the end in terms of why I say that. So allyship is a verb. We're doing things. We're not calling ourselves allies. We're just doing the work. We're not doing it for accolades. We're just doing the work. And we are always accountable to those who are in those equity deserving groups, who we are in allyship with. Okay. And it's using our power and privilege. And I encourage you to really reflect on where your privilege lies and where your power lies. One of the things that I've certainly grappled with and had to really turn things upside down in my own head, in a racialized body and as that intersectionality of being a woman, I've always felt like I'm othered and that I am no different than any other equity deserving group. We're all over here and the dominant group is over here. Coming to terms with my privilege of, yeah, I'm in a racialized body. And I've already given you an example of how that has literally cost me a job and many other things you can imagine. But I also have so much advantage in my education, even in my racial identity. This is where I really had to grapple and recognize that, wow, even in my racialized body, I am not Black. And if I were a Black woman, my experience would be much different. I am not Indigenous. Again, were I, my experience and my trauma would look very different. So yes, racialized, yes, Rumina. However, oh, what a privilege and what power I have over other equity deserving groups. How do I leverage that? Okay, so it's a bit of a head turn. Because particularly, women often will think, we have such a disadvantage not being in male bodies in terms of power, and yet what power do we have in our bodies when we are not living in trans bodies, when we are particularly white women who have the advantage of not being racialized? So I encourage you to really reflect on the idea that you can have privilege and experience oppression at the same time. And most of us do, because there's such a spectrum of privilege that there are many people who sit somewhere in the middle. And so looking for where your power is and how do you leverage that to achieve equity and inclusion for those who don't. How to be an ally. So these are some examples of how we can do that. First of all, as I just described, knowing your own privileges and understanding where your allyship can be most useful, not easy, but easy to sort of get our heads around and start moving. Continue to learn about the different issues and struggles of equity deserving groups. This is ongoing learning and unlearning, and it requires listening. It requires being attuned to what's happening. And if you know anything about equity work, it's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing. And we have to be open and receptive to being very emergent. So we have to pay attention. Oh, I can't say this anymore. This is considered, but yes, that's right. This term is now offensive. This is the correct terminology. Keep moving. Don't get stuck, because we are all learning. Even those of us in racialized bodies are starting to grapple with how embedded some of these things are and how internalized our oppression is. And so, yes, things will continue to change, and your responsibility is to keep up. Asking what support looks like for people you are in solidarity with. Okay, again, it comes back to, and you can maybe even have seen or experienced things where somebody thinks that they're doing the right thing. I know what the community needs that I want to be in solidarity with. I'm going to create this initiative, this program. I'm going to do it because I have that power and privilege, and without ever consulting, without ever asking, without ever looking to the community that you're trying to be in solidarity with to say, what do you need from me? What would help? So we always, to be an ally, you have to align your efforts with what people are asking for. You don't get to decide what the answers are. And particularly in organizations, I think we get stuck sometimes thinking, well, we're the expert. I know what this policy needs to say and what it needs to look like, and so I can do this. In absence of checking in with those who are being impacted by that very policy, we're missing something. So certainly looking to folks to guide us in ways that would be appreciated by them, as opposed to coming up with solutions on our own, which is actually how we got here. Right? Coming up with solutions for ourselves is exactly how we ended up in this mess. So we really need to listen to and be guided by those inequity deserving groups first and foremost. And then the last thing I'd put here is avoid centering yourself, particularly in response to an act of harm. And I'm going to give you a tangible example because it just happened last night. So I have kids that are in the elementary school, and such a fun teacher, one of my twins has, who, an example of centering self. A horrible incident happened. A kiddo opened up the door of the music class, walking in the hallways, opened up the door. And my kids are absolutely the only racialized kids in their class. Opened the door and yelled the N-word and then closed it. Okay, so that's harm. Not just to my child, obviously it was impactful for her, but the entire class heard this. Okay? What the teacher says to my daughter afterwards, next day when he learned about this, instead of saying to her, how are you? I'm so sorry this happened. What can I do to support the impact of harm on you? What he did was, come outside, I want to talk to you in the hallway. I just want you to know that I don't condone this kind of behavior, right? If this ever happens again, I want you to tell me. If anything like this happens, I want you to tell me, because I do not support this type of behavior. On the surface, and I can see what he was trying to do was he was trying to be an ally to say, hey, I don't tolerate this kind of stuff, and you make sure you tell me. But what he did was he centered himself, right? He'll say things like, I've lost friends because of racism. I've told them they can't be my friends anymore. He focuses very much on how he is perceived and how he is projected, as opposed to considering what the impact on the people he is talking to is. Things like, and again, because this is an education environment, things like talking about, I think the other day they were talking about plants and herbs and different types of vegetables, and centered out the only Indigenous girl in the class and said, you must be very familiar with these types of foods and things like that, making an assumption and looking to that individual to sort of speak on behalf of an entire race. That's centering yourself and your mind instead of really considering how the act of harm is actually impacting the other person. So allyship does not require you to be, hey, I'm an ally, hey, look at me. It really is about recognizing and acknowledging how people are being impacted on a daily basis, okay? So when we are an ally, so we hear a lot about, say something, speak up. I want to just make sure that we are considering a number of things in that, okay? Your relationship to the person who is harmed. So you are now a bystander, you've witnessed something happening. You must factor in your relationship with the person who has been offensive, okay? You need to take cues from the person who's been harmed, but your relationship with the person who has harmed needs to be factored in here. If this is someone on the street who hasn't seen this, I've seen this happen. Somebody says something offensive on the street. It is not always safe, right? It is not even worth my effort to address that person and to have them consider the impact of their harmful comments, okay? I'm never going to see them again. There is no relationship to leverage to be able to encourage and to ask them to sort of consider the impact of their words. So in that situation, that relationship is zero, and safety is another factor. I'm not saying anything. It's better to just let it go. I'm not going to affect change. If anyone was at the Black Lives Matter march following George Floyd's murder, there was a bit of a disruptor in the crowd at that event, and so if you're at an event like that, that's not a smart move to sort of try and encourage somebody who's disrupting and who is causing harm in that environment. It's not safe and it's not smart, and there's no relationship to leverage. If it's your boss, if it's someone in a position of power, we have to think about that, right? So, and how we address it as well. So it doesn't mean that because it's someone in a position of power, don't say anything, keep it quiet, but it may mean you have to be a little bit cautious or careful in terms of how and when you say something, okay? Because again, safety and also the impact, right? If there is going to be a negative repercussion on you, you must consider these things. This is what is different about Accompliship, where it doesn't matter what the impact is, you're going to take a stand. But with allyship, there is that consideration that needs to be had. Think also about, again, when I gave the example of how sometimes people will respond and say something and other times they won't, there's context to that. There are many times where I've experienced a microaggression and I've not said anything, and then I pondered, why didn't I say anything? I should have said something. And I have to release that. And many people will share this. I have to release it because I have to remind myself that there's context to this. If this is someone I won't see again, there is no purpose in trying to shift their mind. If it was my family member, my uncle at a dinner table, I might take him on. But someone who is in a position of authority or who has no relationship to me, I may not. The other thing to factor in is your own energy, okay? Because there's no assumption that everybody who is doing allyship work is in the dominant group, is male, white, cis, able-bodied. No, I do allyship work. I'm in a racialized body. So that means that there are days when I don't have the energy, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you have to do it regardless of the impact on yourself. So there is context to when and how you speak up. And some of that can be just based on your own mental health, your own well-being, and your own resources. And so we need to be kind to one another. And so again, if we're all working towards being allies, if I need to step back because I haven't got the energy in me, oh, what a benefit when somebody else who has the energy and has the resources in them to say something so that it doesn't get lost, that it's not all on one person. When we're all collectively doing this work, somebody will likely say something, okay? And this is my last kind of thoughts to you, is the most impactful act of allyship, as I have seen, is when we respond as if this happened to you. So a lot of community came up and, was really, really grappling with what happened to the Afzaal family. And that's important. But when we respond as if it happened to your own family, when even a slight microaggression has occurred and you act as if it happened to you, to your best friend, to your mother, your grandmother, when you take an injustice that has happened to somebody else as if it was directly a threat and an injustice towards you, regardless of your identity, that's when we start to make a change. When we actually think and feel as if it happened to us, we then have an opportunity to, I encourage you to think about how you would respond differently to any act of hate if it was as if it happened to you. What would you say? How would you feel? What would you do differently? Because it's one thing to do it in support of others. It's another when you respond from your body as if it had happened to your own identity. So for me, the most impactful thing you can do is always respond as if it had directly happened to you or your family member. So I don't have to identify as queer to have an indignation to somebody who is harmed because they're in a queer body. If I respond as if I were queer, what would I do differently? How would I behave? How would I stand up for? What would I say? I encourage you to think about that in terms of what you can tangibly do. And sometimes it is just acting as if it was an indignation directed at you. So with that, I will stop my presentation, and we have about 15 minutes, and I would love to hear if you have any questions, any thoughts, any reflections in terms of what we've just talked about.
Thank you so much, Rumina, for this great presentation. That was amazing. That, it's a great way to connect everything that has been happening this week with what happened last year and with the continuous learning that we have to do. To the audience, thank you for being here today. My name is Anna Bowler, and I'm the Digital Learning Specialist with the EDI office, and I will be facilitating the Q&A today for Rumina. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A to type your questions, and I will happily let Rumina know, and we'll hear from her. So to begin the Q&A, I have some questions for you, Rumina. So one of the things that you mentioned in the presentation was about privilege and how we all hold privileges, and sometimes we don't know. So this is a term, to be honest, that when I started to learn about EDI, it made me feel really uncomfortable. So I had a sip of that cup of discomfort that you were talking about at the beginning of the presentation. And I'm thinking that many people in the audience and maybe people who they know are struggling with that concept of recognizing that we have privilege and we don't know. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about that process of discovering what we can do to discover more of those privileges and going through that struggle of recognizing them and using them to kind of like use that power to help equity deserving groups.
Thank you, Anna. And you're right. And as I identified, I struggled with this too, thinking that what privilege do I have in society with the body that I'm in? And it is an absolute mind shift, especially, I think about, the language of privilege. I don't love it because people often think about financial privilege. And most people's response to the idea that they have privilege is to think and say, I had it hard growing up. I come from a lone parent. We had mental health, poverty. How can you say that I have any advantage over anybody else? And it's not to discount that. It's not to say that you had it easy. It is to settle into the idea that as difficult as you had it, as many barriers as you might have had, other people in other bodies have additional barriers, and it is that much harder for them. And racially, we as a society, we've really sort of fed this myth that if you work hard, get educated, and you get a good job, and you live happily ever after. This is the global myth. Canada is known to be a place. People are coming to this land because of all the opportunities it provides. People don't understand how deeply racist our society is. So in trying to wrap our heads around privilege, this is not about financial privilege. And I encourage people to think about, it's hard racially. So often people will say, yes, and if an Indigenous Black person would just work harder, they could make it as I have had to struggle and made it. And it's very hard to get our heads around that one. So where I tend to sort of give people a bit of a way to think about it is to think about abilities and to think about, all of the struggles that you and I may have had in our even myself in the body that I'm in. And then consider literally just having a disability, being in a wheelchair, thinking about all the job opportunities, all the educational opportunities that you would have had to navigate. You would have had literally physical barriers in your way. If anyone has ever had a moment of disability, right? Often we have a child who's broken a leg, or we've been in crutches, or an elderly parent, someone post-surgery. You very quickly realize the world is not made for folks who are not able-bodied. It's actually not designed for everybody. And in that moment, you can kind of see, whoa, and we're so grateful when we can get back to being in our able bodies. And it's interesting because ability is the one thing that could absolutely affect any one of us. If you're in a white body, you're not turning into a Black body. That's not happening. But you and I both in the same moment could be disabled. So if you can get your head around that, if you were in a wheelchair, even going, at 15 years old, going out for your first part-time job, the attitudinal barriers that you would have to go through to be able to prove and demonstrate differently that you have worth, that you have ability to do the job. If that is something that you can get your head around, then again, it's back to believing, and statistically, there's no question that in other bodies, those folks have a much harder time, as evidenced by our world and our society and our leadership, right? There's no denying it. So it's not something that is innate to people that they are just less than. It is the system doing exactly what it's designed to do. We're in a capitalist society. Most people are coming from humble beginnings. We're a very new country. Most people have an immigration story that is just behind their shoulder. And most people who come as immigrants have left much and have come starting over. Like white people, I'm talking, not just racialized people. When I say immigrants, let's not forget we're talking about most of us in this part of the world are immigrants. So of course you've had humble beginnings, and of course you've had to work hard, and you would have had it harder if you were in a different body. And if we can get our heads around that, then we can start to go, so I haven't had it easy, but I do have privilege over others. And it's finding that sweet spot of understanding that two things can be true at the same time. You could have had it hard and it could have been harder. And for many, it is harder. So that's how I sort of try to grapple with this idea of privilege. It's some of the work that I've had to do and I encourage others to do. Don't get stuck. Don't get stuck and believe adamantly that there's no way that you have privilege. Because, I think if I can just say one more thing, often people will say white men have privilege in our society. Well, yes, predominantly they do. But if you put me and have me next to a white male who's older, who's in a wheelchair, who's underhoused, who has mental health, who has privilege between the two of us? I'm middle class, I have a home, I have an income, I have education, my mental health most days is okay. Who has privilege in that situation, right? So how can I then walk around and say I have no privilege? Of course I do. In comparison to somebody else, I always will. Most people don't sit on the spectrum of having zero privilege. Most people don't. And so find yours, and then how do you leverage it? So that's kind of how I wrap my head around it, because it's complicated, because people get stuck. Oh, I don't have privilege. Keep going, keep going. Consider where yours is, as opposed to it's not a yes or no, I have it, I don't. It's where is yours? Where does it lie? And then how do you leverage it?
Thank you, Rumina. That's such a good point. It's kind of like considering that perspective taking when we're analyzing the reality and our environment. And I think that part of being stuck can also come when you're thinking about others who have more privilege than you, right? And you start thinking, why is it that they have more privilege? And that it's good to understand the why, but it is important to move forward and say, what can I do with whatever I have to, make a change? So that's a great reflection. Thank you. Another question that I have is, you were talking about how to be an ally. We need to understand what support looks like for that group. So I know many people who would ask in this scenario of Islamophobia, what can I do in terms of, I don't have any friends who are close to me that I can actually offer help or support. So if I want to know, but I don't know anybody in the community, what can you do?
Another great question. And often, our biases and our fears of other people is rooted in the lack of connection and the lack of knowledge, because there's no denying. So we're all human beings. We all have, we're all navigating very similar things and trying to live a good life and live in peace. And the commonalities are so obvious, and yet we get stuck because we don't know, we don't understand. So there are ways to sort of initiate those types of connections. It may not be, maybe in your neighborhood, you've got families that are reflective and are more diverse. How do you engage with them? How do you get to know them? How do you acknowledge them? How do you relate to them in your workspaces? Because this is, our city is growing in a population wise, but also in diversity in terms of the community is starting to reflect a number of different cultures and a number of different racial identities. So it's hard to say that you have no way to connect with people. You may have some fear, you may have some apprehension, you may have some discomfort, but pushing past that, what would you do if the person looks like you, right? It's almost like when you think about asking people, where do you come from? I say to people, do you ask people that look like you? Where do they come from? Or is this reserved only for those who look ethnically different? Start looking at people as people and overcome that apprehension, because we know they want the same things that you do, right? Generally, they may have different ways of being, of praying, of eating. You have an opportunity there to learn and to grow. And in so doing, your mind can get broadened. And also, let's not forget that when you do try to make some initiatives and some conversations with people who are different than yourself or your identity, you're also only getting a little snippet. So you talk to one Muslim person, you are going to get one idea. This idea of cultural competency is a bit nonsensical, because even within one culture or one faith, you will have millions of different ways of taking up the faith, millions of different ways of how people interpret their own faith, their own culture. We're also navigating a country where we have a lot of people coming from other parts of the world who are trying to hold on to some of their identities, but are also relinquishing some of them. Assimilation is part of the way we internalize oppression. Let me just act more like, so that I am not harmed. So people are trying to find their way in this society. And there's an opportunity to sort of, I think about what the future of our country looks like, and how we can sort of appreciate that not everybody who comes here is trying to only be their identity. There's an opportunity to create a new Canadian identity, which embraces all of it. So there are ways that you can sort of take the initiative. There are so many resources available that we never had years ago that you can learn, that you can read. Exposing yourself, it's not all about just, hi, nice to meet you, you look different than me, I'd like to get to know you. It is also putting yourself in those situations. So going to events that are not, that are culturally different, putting yourself in those environments. When you hear about something happening in the community, showing up, being a part of it, supporting, go to those people, because the communities are always welcoming and wanting to share. And one of the biggest things that the Muslim community has talked about is exactly what you said, that people don't know us, and without knowing us, they won't see the commonalities. People literally don't understand that the faith of Christianity and the faith of Islam are so much more similar than not. We've done a really good job of differentiating as if it's something completely different, and yet the core values are no different. What major religion has a different value than Islam and Christianity? Like, they all have the same fundamental beliefs, but in the absence of sort of getting to know and understand that, so you don't have to meet people necessarily. You can, but you can also expose yourself to different worldviews, to different ideas, reading, culture, art. What do you have? What are you exposed to? And then just pushing past that and just going a little bit deeper into immersing yourself into other ways of being. It only enlightens you, and it helps you to understand how people have many different ways of existing. None is better than the other, if you will.
Thank you so much. I really like that perspective of, even if you don't feel 100% confident, just, take your time from the distance and then walk a little bit closer. So I really like that approach. Leslie.
I just realized I can't write a Q&A in the Q&A section as a host. So I just wondered, Rumina, if you would speak a bit more about accomplishment. Because I know when these events happen, I'm always left wondering, where were the allies? Like, why wasn't like anyone in the community standing right beside that individual that ends up on the news or is telling a story? Like, I truly believe there's more allies out there. But if you could speak to, how do we move beyond allyship and be able to be an accomplice?
I will, with my dog barking in the background. I apologize. Yeah, I think for me, it comes back to when you take it as if it is against you. So when I spoke up about the microaggressions, as I said, they weren't directed at me, but I acted as if they were. I acted as if it actually happened to me or my mother or my friend. And that moves us out of sort of just being protective of our own identities and also trying to be helpful. It actually forces us to take what comes with that when we speak up, when we stand up. And so it's using your privilege of not being in that body. So as I've sort of said, for me, it's how do I leverage the fact that I'm not Black? How do I leverage the fact that I'm not Indigenous? I am heard differently. And it grosses me out to say it. It upsets me when my colleagues will say to me, thank you for saying that, Rumina, because it came from me. I'm the angry Black woman. And it makes me very angry to hear that. And I have to push past that and go, so if they're listening to me differently than you, then what am I going to say? How am I going to push your issues further? Even more than I don't talk about extensively about the impact on South Asian people, because I know that there are people who are doing that. I have an opportunity in my role to talk about those who are most impacted by racial harm. So that accomplishment just asks you to just go further than looking out for you within the allyship. It says you take one for the team, and it could mean literally, it could be livelihood, it could cost you, but that you will do that. And if we all did that, can you imagine if we all took it like it happened to us? I can't even imagine what that would do in terms of changing systems. So for me, it's really act as if it's happening to you, forces you to become an accomplice.
Thank you so much, Rumina, and thank you for reminding us that there is also that cost that we need to be aware of, because I know that many people might not be aware of it or might be afraid because of that cost. So we need to be courageous. And we have one more question, Ragad.
If there are no other questions, I don't want to take away from any questions that the participants may have.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rumina, and Anna and Leslie and Mars for navigating and facilitating this excellent discussion. Something really interesting just came to my mind, Rumina, when you mentioned, like, put yourself in their shoes. If it was you, how would you have reacted? And it kind of brought me back to a session we had a couple weeks ago. Anna was with me when we talked about embedding compassion into the work of EDI, right? And it really made me think of this ability that, you know, one of the common elements of compassion is to think of common humanity, right? And that just like I suffer, they suffer, I suffer, right? And that concept of, at the end of the day, we are all part of this human race. And I know it sounds simplistic, but at the same time, it's really, I feel like, gets to the root of that. Yes, this person, of course, has lived experiences that I need to recognize and acknowledge, but at the end of the day, if it were me, what would I do? So thank you so much for, I feel like that reaffirmed perhaps the approach that we're hoping to bring into our EDI work. And I'm very fortunate that Anna will be joining me in this professional learning community that we're hoping to cultivate. And again, I'd love to hear from you about any thoughts on that compassion piece in EDI work.
I will leave it with saying you're 100% right. What we're really talking about is compassion and empathy. And so, you know, the response from the community, as much as it was grief in relation to what happened, but there's almost an element of, oh, poor you, oh, those poor people, oh, how unfortunate for them. And what happens when you go, oh, poor me, this happened to me, this was my family, it's different. And that is what compassion requires you to do. So you cannot do equity work without compassion and empathy. There is no way forward. If we cannot put ourselves into the experience of other people, believing them and acting as if it is happening to us, how on earth can we move things forward? So for me, it is inherent to the work. And I'm so glad that you raised that. Thank you, Ragad.
Thank you, Ragad. And thank you, Rumina, once more for being here with us and for taking the time to sharing your knowledge and sharing some of the things that we can do, some of the actions that we can do to fight against Islamophobia and to be able to support our community, especially here at Western End in London. So thank you so much. And thank you for the participants who took the time to come today and having that interest in learning more about this topic. And I'm really sure that we are all taking some tools that will help us move forward in this work together. So thank you all. And with this, we are done with the session. Thank you for coming, and we hope to see you in a future session. Have a good day, everyone.